The afternoon train came through Harlan's Creek at 2:30, and on that particular Thursday in October, it brought with it a cold front off the plains and a woman standing alone on the platform with a brown leather case and a basket covered in blue cloth. He was across the street. He had been rehanging the shutter on the assay office since late morning, the loose hinge finally giving him enough cause to climb the ladder and do it right. He had the hammer in his hand and one eye on the level when the train released its brake and the platform filled. He was not watching for anything. He was watching the way a man watches open ground, not looking, exactly, just keeping it in view. He saw the rancher first. Hard to miss a man that size, moving with that much certainty through a crowd, his coat still carrying the dust of 7 miles. The man walked directly to the woman, stopped in front of her, and said something that did not take long to say. The woman went still. Not the stillness of shock, something older than that. The stillness of a person who has been braced for a particular kind of blow, long enough that when it lands, the body already knows what to do. The rancher's voice carried. The platform was not large, and the wind had gone quiet in that particular moment, the way it sometimes does in the high plains, as though the air itself was waiting. Not what he'd been led to expect. That was most of it. Couldn't use her. The woman did not move. She did not turn to watch him go. She stood with the leather case at her feet and the blue basket held in both hands at her waist, and she looked at a point somewhere past the end of the platform, past the last storefront, past the road, out toward the flat brown distance that stretches east of town until it becomes sky. The rancher walked off the platform and did not look back. Around the woman, people moved. Some slowly, the way people move when they are trying to seem as though they are not watching. Some, more quickly, embarrassed for her or embarrassed for themselves. A child grabbed its mother's hand and was pulled along. 2 men near the freight car said something to each other with their heads down. She still had not moved. He came down the ladder. He did it without deciding to. The foot found the next rung and then he was standing on the ground with the hammer still in his hand, looking across the street at the platform. She was 20 yards away, and the whole town was watching her, and she knew it, and she was not going to let any of them see her flinch. He noticed that he had stopped working. He kept his eyes on her and waited to see what she would do next. The train had arrived at 2:30. She had known the hour because she had checked her watch 3 times in the last 20 minutes of the journey, turning it over in her palm, and then closing her fingers around it again. The coach had been warm and close and smelled of coal smoke and the wool of strangers, and outside the window the land had opened until there was nothing left to interrupt it. No hill, no tree line, just the flat particular light of a Colorado afternoon in October. She had smoothed her skirt before the train stopped. She had picked up the brown leather case with the brass buckle and set the blue sewing basket over her arm. She had arranged herself, in other words, the way a person arranges themselves before something that matters. The platform had not been empty. That was the thing she had not accounted for. She had expected him alone, or nearly. Instead, there were a dozen people, men near the freight car, 2 women in conversation who paused it, a child sitting on a crate with its boots not reaching the ground. The ordinary business of a small town at the arrival of the afternoon train. She had stepped down from the coach and stood straight and looked around, and there he had been. A broad man, not old but getting there, with land in his face the way men get it when they've worked it long enough. He had looked at her for a moment, not long. Then he had said that she was not what he had been led to expect. He said it quietly. That was the part she kept returning to. He had not said it in anger, or with any heat in it at all. He had said it the way a man might say that the lumber was the wrong cut. A fact, a problem, something to be resolved. He said that he could not use her, and he said it like he was sorry to have wasted anyone's time. And then he had picked up his hat from under his arm and put it on and walked off the platform. She had watched him go. Around her, the freight was being unloaded. Around her, people were moving and not quite looking at her, and looking at her anyway, and the child on the crate had gone still, with its boots hanging, watching. She did not cry. There was something in her that noted this as important, that somewhere between Cincinnati and here, she had used up the kind of softness that cries at things. What was left was harder and quieter, and it kept her upright on that platform with her leather case in one hand and her sewing basket over her arm, and the whole town of Harlan's Creek arranged around her like a theater. She looked east, past the last storefront, out to where the land went flat and colorless and enormous. She was 28 years old, and she had $11 and some coins, and no one in the world expected anything of her at all. She had not moved yet. She had not moved yet when she heard the footsteps. Not hurried, not the careful avoiding kind that had been passing her since the train pulled out. These were deliberate, the sound of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it across the planks of the platform without second-guessing it. She turned. The woman was stout and short, and somewhere in her 50s, with a wool coat buttoned to the throat and gray hair pinned so flat it looked like it didn't dare move without permission. She walked like someone who owned the ground she crossed, not through arrogance, but through long familiarity with it. She stopped 2 feet away and looked at the leather traveling case, and then at the sewing basket covered in blue cloth, and then, finally, at her face. She did not offer condolences. She did not say anything about what had just happened on this platform. She said, "Can you sew?" Not as a pleasantry, as a question with practical consequences. She said yes. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The woman nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Fine work or rough? Both, mostly fine. The woman looked at the basket again. Alterations, yes. Difficult ones, waistlines, linings, that sort of thing, yes. She watched the woman think. It was not a long process. Whatever calculation was happening moved quickly, the way calculations do when they are made by someone who has been making them for a long time and trusts the outcome. "I have a room above the feed store," the woman said. "It's small, single window, faces north. There's a stove that draws well if you leave the flue open a quarter turn." She said it the way you describe a room you are renting, not a room you are giving away. The arrangement would be fair. Work taken in through the store, percentage to me for the space and the address. The rest yours. Board included while you're getting started. Around them, the platform had gone quiet, in the way that isn't actually quiet, in the way where everyone is listening and pretending not to. She was aware of all of it. She was aware that this woman was doing something that cost her something, in a town this size, in a situation with this much recent history attached to it. She had not finished answering the question about difficult alterations before the offer came. "That was not an accident. I'd need thread," she said. "Various weights. And a good light. There's a lamp," the woman said. "Thread you'll buy from the store at cost." She looked east one more time. The land out past the last storefront was still flat, and still enormous, and still indifferent. She looked back. "All right," she said. The woman picked up the leather traveling case before she could reach for it herself. Not as a courtesy exactly, more as a conclusion. They walked off the platform together. The room was small. A single window facing west, a narrow bed with a quilt that had been washed so many times the pattern had gone soft at the edges. A table, a chair, a hook on the wall beside the door, where someone had hung a strip of leather to hold it open in summer. She set the sewing basket on the table first, then her coat over the chair. She did not sit. She stood in the middle of the floor for a moment, the way you stand in a room you are still deciding about, measuring its corners, its light, the particular sound the floorboards made when her weight shifted left. It was hers for now. That was enough. She counted the money out of the bottom of the traveling case and laid it on the table beside the basket. $11 and some coins. She arranged the coins by size, then by value, then pushed them all into a small pile and left them. The lamp from the hook by the door she carried to the table. She trimmed the wick with the small pair of scissors she kept in the outer pocket of the basket and lit it. The window was black. Somewhere below, the feed store had gone quiet. She had heard boots on the stairs an hour ago, a door, then nothing. The street outside was the kind of quiet that only exists when the cold has finally persuaded everyone indoors. She sat at the table and looked at the money and did not think about Cincinnati. She thought about thread weights instead. What she had, what she would need, what the first 2 weeks of orders might require, if any orders came at all. She thought about needles. Her best ones were wrapped in a cloth sleeve at the bottom of the basket. 46 of them, various gauges, which was more than most people owned, and less than she would prefer. She had almost built it into a plan when she noticed the window. Not what was outside it. There was nothing outside it but dark, and the edge of a roofline across the street. What was on the sill? A tin candle holder. Olive green, the paint worn at the rim, small enough to hold in one hand. A fresh candle in it, burned down no more than a 1/4 inch. Still lit. She did not move toward it right away. She sat where she was and looked at it. She had not put it there. The woman from the feed store had not shown it to her when she'd walked her up and said goodnight at the door. It had simply appeared on the sill, the way things appear when someone has moved carefully and not wanted to be asked about it. The flame didn't waver. The room was still enough for that. She pulled the chair to the window and sat with it for a long time, her hands in her lap, not thinking about plans or thread weights or the cost of anything at all. She slept better than she had any right to. The candle had burned itself down to a stub by the time she thought to notice it again, and the room had gone gray with the kind of early light that arrives before the sun has committed to anything. She lay still for a moment, listening. The street below was quiet, a cart somewhere, a door, the ordinary sounds of a town that had not yet remembered she was in it. She dressed carefully, the way she always had, not out of vanity but out of habit, formed long ago, when her mother had told her that a woman who looked as though she'd made an effort was harder to dismiss. She smoothed the collar of her dress. She pulled her hair back. She set the brown case against the wall and the sewing basket on the table, and then she sat with the basket a moment, not opening it, just feeling the familiar weight of it under her palms. The steps down to the feed store were narrow and turned once near the bottom. She had not yet counted them. She was on the last one, ducking her head under the low frame of the stair door, when she found the girl. She was 7, maybe, standing at the base of the stairs with both hands behind her back, looking up with the specific patience of a child who has been waiting for some time and is not going to admit it. Her coat was buttoned uneven, one side higher than the other, the bottom hem askew. She had her father's coloring, the same quietness in her face, the same sense of watching before deciding. Her eyes went immediately to the basket. She did not ask. She simply looked, the way a child looks at something through a shop window, measuring the distance between wanting and asking. The woman sat down on the bottom step, not because her legs were tired, because it put them at the same level. She set the basket on her knee and turned back the blue cloth. The girl came forward one step, then stopped. Inside, spools of thread in 8 colors, a pair of small scissors with handles shaped like a crane, a pincushion sewn from scraps of wool, 3 needles already threaded and wound around a slip of card, a thimble that had belonged to her mother. The girl reached out one finger and touched the edge of the pincushion. Just the edge. They stayed like that for a while. The woman let her look. She pointed out the crane scissors and let the girl hold them, closed. She showed her how the thimble fit, though it was too large for the small finger. She did not ask the girl her name. She did not ask where her father was, or why she was here, or whether anyone knew she had come. The girl did not ask anything either. They sat together in the dim stairwell while the town came awake around them, and the conversation never once went somewhere that hurt. The jacket came first. A man from the tannery left it outside her door before she had even hung the blue cloth over the basket again. A folded note on top that said, "Split at the shoulder, can't afford new." She opened the seam, cut a reinforcing strip from a scrap she had brought from Cincinnati, and had it back together before noon. She left it outside his door with no note of her own. By the next morning there were two more. She set up her work at the table by the window, where the light came in from the east in the mornings, and from the south in the afternoons. She draped a piece of muslin across the surface so the fabric wouldn't catch on the grain of the wood. She arranged her spools and her needles and her small scissors, and she began, moving through the orders the way she had always moved through work, without haste, without waste. The wedding dress arrived on the third day, carried by a girl about 17 with her mother walking 2 steps behind. The hem needed 4 inches let out, which meant the original hem had been taken up by someone in a hurry, and the original stitching was still there, faint and even, running through the fabric like a ghost. She unpicked it with the crane scissors and pressed the crease out with a damp cloth and a flat iron she borrowed from the feed store owner's wife. She rehemmed it so the ghost was gone. The mother looked at the finished work for a long time without speaking. Then she left $3.50 on the table, which was more than had been agreed. By the end of the week, there was a small stack of folded pieces on the left side of the table, finished, and a small stack of pieces on the right, not yet. The stack on the right was larger. The deputy's uniform came on Friday. She knew it was him before she looked up. The way the step on the landing took the weight. She had noticed already how he moved. No sound she didn't expect. Nothing placed down hard. He set the jacket across the corner of her table. Dark wool, brass buttons. One of the collar seams split clean through, where someone had moved wrong in a hurry, or maybe been grabbed by it. She turned it over once to see both sides of the break. He said, "The collar needs to hold." She nodded. He did not say anything else for a moment. She could hear him deciding something. Then, "How much?" She told him. It was a fair price. He set the coins on the table without counting them out slowly, which she noticed. He looked once around the room, the muslin on the table, the spools arranged by color, the tin candle holder still on the windowsill. The candle burned down a third of the way, and then he was gone. She picked up the jacket and found the seam. She finished the collar seam that evening by candlelight, the tin holder throwing its small circle across the table. The wool was good quality, heavier than what most men in Harlan's Creek wore, but not new. The buttons had been polished recently. She could tell by the way the tarnish sat only in the engraving, the flat faces clean. Someone had taken care of it before bringing it to her. She set it aside when the light grew too unsteady to trust the line, and she went to bed. In the morning she came down the stairs carrying her sewing basket and her mind already on the day's stack, and she was 3 steps from the bottom before she understood that something was different. She stopped. She set her foot down again on the 4th step, then the 3rd. Put her weight on it. Nothing. She moved to the 2nd step, then the landing, then turned back and went up to the 5th step and came down again. No sound. The board that had shifted under her every morning since she'd arrived, the one that caught and released with a particular groan, the one she had started stepping over on the left side to spare herself the sound of it, was flat and still and solid as the rest. She stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment. She did not know when it had been done. She had been up and down those stairs a dozen times the day before, and she had not heard anyone working, and she had not seen anyone on the landing. It had simply been attended to, the way a thing gets attended to when someone decides it needs doing and goes and does it. She went in and put the kettle on. The girl came by late in the afternoon, the way she had started doing, not every day, but often enough that it had become a kind of pattern. She sat in the chair near the window and watched the needlework, without asking to touch anything, which the woman had noticed and respected. They talked sometimes. Mostly they were quiet together, which suited them both. At some point the girl looked down at her boots, and then up again, and said without much in her voice, "My father walks past here sometimes. When he's going to the livery, or coming back from the edge of town, he checks things." The woman did not look up from the seam she was closing. She said, "I know." The girl seemed satisfied with that. She stayed another quarter hour and then went home for supper, and the woman listened to her cross the street. She sat with the jacket in her lap and the candle burning beside her, and did not start the next seam right away. She thought about the stair. She thought about the particular attention required to fix something quietly enough that the person who uses it every day doesn't know it's been done until they are already past it. She picked up the needle. She finished the jacket. She did not think about anything else. The woman who came in that Thursday was not the first to look at the room as though it proved something. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed for Harlan's Creek, a good wool coat, hair pinned tight, the kind of posture that had been practiced until it stopped feeling like effort. She carried a cream-colored blouse folded over one arm and set it on the work table, without being invited to. The blouse had a torn seam at the shoulder and a button missing from the cuff. The woman took it up and turned it in her hands, reading it the way she read all cloth, what had given first, how the thread had worn, whether the fabric would hold another seam, or whether it needed to be reinforced from underneath. She reached for her pincushion. The customer watched her. "I heard you've been kept quite busy," the woman said. Her voice was pleasant in the way of someone choosing each word before releasing it. "Considering everything. It's good to have a skill, I suppose, when other options close off." She let that sit. The woman pinning the shoulder seam did not look up. She set the first pin, smoothed the fabric, set the second. Her hands did not slow. "I imagine it's steadying," the customer continued. "Having something useful to do, while you decide what comes next." The woman finished the shoulder, moved to the cuff. She held the blouse up briefly to check the line, then set it flat again and pinned where the button would need to go. Her breathing was even. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the street outside, and from somewhere below, the creak of the feed store door. She folded the blouse carefully and set it on the edge of the table. 40 cents, she said. "I can have it ready by Saturday noon." The customer picked up the blouse. She seemed for a moment to expect something else, a flinch perhaps, or an appeal, something that would confirm the shape of things as she understood them. She got nothing. "Saturday, then," the woman said, and left. The door, still the old door with its stubborn latch, took 2 attempts to catch behind her. The woman stood at the work table and looked at the space where the blouse had been. Then she picked up her pincushion and began resetting the pins she'd pulled. Outside, the step creaked once. She had not heard him come. She did not know when he had arrived or how much of it he'd been there for. He made no sound that suggested he had heard anything or had any opinion about what he had heard. But the step creaked again a minute later, and then again, and he did not leave. She could hear him shifting his weight, one foot, then the other, the way a man does when he has somewhere to be but is not ready to be there yet. She worked through 3 more pins before the step went quiet. The wind shifted sometime in the night. She heard it in her sleep, a low pull at the eaves, the creak of the building settling, and in the morning, the air inside was cold enough that her breath showed faintly when she first sat up. She went to the window. She had learned to approach it with both hands ready, because the latch had a habit of giving way on the second gust if she did not hold it. She reached for it, closed her fingers around the iron. It caught. She pressed it again, released it, pressed, caught clean, both times, with a solidity the latch had never had before. She stood for a moment with her fingers still on the iron, not quite believing the small fact of it. There was no note, no indication of when it had been done, or how long the work had taken. Just the latch, sitting true in its housing as if it had always been that way. She opened the window and closed it, opened it again. Outside, the street was pale and still, frost on the edges of the boards. A horse tied in front of the general store, its breath rising. No one about yet who would have seen her standing there with her hand on a window that finally worked the way it was supposed to work. She pulled the window shut one more time and turned back to the room. The tin candle holder was on the work table where she'd left it the night before. Olive green, small enough to sit in a palm. She had moved it twice since the first night, once to the table, once to the shelf above the wash basin, as if she hadn't decided what it was, or what it should be allowed to mean. She picked it up now. She carried it to the windowsill and set it there, in the corner where the light from the street would catch it in the evening, where it would show from outside if someone were walking past and happened to look up. She was not sure why she did it exactly that way. She did not examine the reasoning. She stood back and looked at it where it sat, the green against the pale wood of the sill, the candle worn down to 2/3 now from the nights she had let it burn. Then she put on her apron, opened the work table drawer, and took out the day's first order. A man's vest with a split seam along the left side. Plain work. She threaded her needle and bent close to the cloth. Outside, the frost was already starting to soften in the morning light. Clara came by late morning, without announcement, the way she always did now. She appeared in the doorway wearing her coat buttoned wrong, one side hanging lower than the other, and she stood there for a moment looking at the work table as if she were deciding whether she had anything to say. The woman looked up from a hem she had been taking in. She moved the pin case to one side and gave the girl room to approach. Clara came and stood at the corner of the table. She looked at the sewing basket, at the current order, at the small jar of buttons sorted by size. Then she looked up. "What's your favorite color?" The woman set down the hem. She thought about it, genuinely, the way the question seemed to require. Not the first color that came to mind. The real one. "Dark green," she said, "like river water when there's shade over it." Clara received this with an expression the woman had come to recognize. A specific stillness the girl wore when something mattered to her, and she did not intend to say so. Her eyes held the answer a moment, as if storing it carefully. Then she nodded once. She did not write it down. She did not say why she had asked. She looked at the jar of buttons for another few seconds, selected nothing, and drifted toward the window where the candle holder sat on the sill. She looked at it without touching it. "It's lower than before," she said. "It's been burning." Clara accepted this and turned away from the window. She said she had to go. She left the way she had come, coat still crooked, steps unhurried on the stair. The woman listened to the sound of the door at the bottom of the landing, the brief rectangle of street noise, and then the close of it. She picked up the hem again. The thread was still where she had left it, needle standing upright in the cloth. She worked for a while without moving from the spot. The question sat with her, not unpleasantly. There was no reason a child would need to know a person's favorite color. There was no context that made it practical or sensible. Clara had simply wanted to know, had been told, and had filed it somewhere inside herself with great care. She did not examine the thought further. She pulled the thread through and bent close to the fabric, checking the line. Outside, someone was driving a wagon along the main street. She could hear the slow creak of it, the particular patience of a horse that knew the road. The morning went on around her, quiet and ordinary. The last day of November came in cold and pale, the kind of morning where the sky looked like something had been pulled out of it overnight and not replaced. She had been in Harlan's Creek 6 weeks. The rent was paid, not scraped together at the last moment, not borrowed against goodwill, paid in full on the first of the month, with $3 left over, which she set in the tin box she kept on the shelf above her work table. The waiting list was written on the inside cover of the small ledger, the feed store owner's wife had given her, names in her own careful hand, with dates beside them. 6 entries. She had stopped counting after 5, because counting felt like tempting something. She had not thought of Cincinnati in over a week. She noticed this the same way she had once noticed the absence of a sound she had grown used to. Not with feeling, exactly, but with a kind of steadiness. The way ground feels underfoot when you have not yet registered that you stopped expecting it to shift. He arrived mid-morning, before the light had fully settled. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of lumber set down deliberately, one piece at a time, and then the low percussion of tools being sorted from a box. She did not go to the window. She kept to the hem she was working on, pulling the thread slow and even. By noon, he had been outside her door for most of 3 hours. She set the work down, went to the stove, and poured 2 cups of coffee. She did not ask if he wanted it. She opened the door, the old one, the one that stuck in the cold, and handed him a cup. He took it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The air was sharp and smelled of cut wood and frost, and the particular dryness of late autumn in that part of the country. He was wearing his work coat, sawdust on the sleeve. She had come out without her shawl, and the cold pressed in immediately, but she did not go back for it. He looked at the door frame. She looked at it too. He had replaced the jamb on one side. She could see the new wood, pale against the weathered siding. He drank the coffee. She held her own cup with both hands. Out on the street, 2 men passed, talking without looking over. A dog tracked something along the far boardwalk with great purpose and disappeared around the corner of the hardware store. She went back inside. He set the cup on the boards beside his tools and picked up the saw. 3 mornings later, she came down the stairs before first light, her sewing basket over one arm, and stopped at the bottom step. There was a door, dark green, hung true in the frame he had been reshaping for a week without saying why. The paint was dry but recent. She could smell it faintly in the cold air of the stairwell. She stood there long enough for her eyes to adjust, and her mind to settle around what she was seeing. The color was precise. The color she had named once to the girl, in passing, the way you name a thing when you do not expect anyone to be listening. He was standing on the step outside, not knocking, not waiting in any performed way, simply standing with his hands at his sides and his work coat on, the way he stood when he had finished something, and was deciding whether it needed anything else. She reached out and touched the edge of the door. The wood was smooth and solid under her fingers. The latch fit cleanly into its plate. She could tell without testing it, just from the way the whole thing sat in the frame. She tested it anyway. It caught without effort. She released it. Through the small window beside the door, the sky was going pale at the horizon. The first gray light of a November morning in that part of the country, flat and cold and without drama. She looked at him. He looked at the door the way he looked at things he had made, checking for what he might have missed. Then he looked at her. Neither of them spoke. She was aware of the tin candle holder on the sill behind her, the one that had been there since the first night, the flame long spent and replaced a dozen times over. She was aware of the cold coming through the open door frame around him, and of the sewing basket on her arm, and of the fact that she had $11 less, whatever she had spent, and a full book of orders, and no particular reason to be anywhere else in the world. She stepped aside. He came in. He did not look around the room the way a stranger would. He looked at the window where the morning was beginning to come through, and at the table where her work was laid out, and at the candle holder, briefly, as if confirming something. She closed the door behind him. The latch caught clean. Outside, Harlan's Creek went about its morning. The sound of the livery, a cart on the frozen street, someone calling across the distance between 2 buildings. The town, doing what it did, not watching now, just going on.